Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. So Ukraine War news update, the first part thereof, if you don't include my massive bit on Russian disinformation and the indictments and whatnot with the DOJ from this morning. Otherwise, this is my normal first news video for the day, for the 5th of September 2024. Just a little update. I'm going to do a live interview tonight on my other channel. It's my philosophical channel. It's going to be to do with stuff that's not remotely connected to Ukraine. So just a warning that if you see something flash up from my other channel and you're like, oh yeah, let's watch this, it's going to be some Ukraine stuff. No, it won't be. Please pop along, but you might be bored or supremely interested in the philosophical, historical, archaeological exegesis of certain accounts from the past, or maybe not from the past. That's the point. Anyway, I digress. So we'll get on to the stats for today. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, of course. We have, you can find those caveats in the description to my video below. 1,200 personnel loss, which is a slight downtick from where it has been. We've seen above 1,300 for a couple of days. That's bringing it down to still a really significant number of personnel lost. 6 tanks below the daily average, but still fairly significant. 21 troop carrying AFVs, likewise, although that's above the daily average. Actually, no, that's a pretty good number, to be honest, because that's been a little bit up and down, but I think that the Russians are attacking a number of places. We've got some videos of losing quite a few bits of equipment actually over the daily average in AFVs. I think is significant. And even 6 tanks, I think that shows that the Russians are still pushing in a number of places. 31 artillery systems is not quite double the daily average. We have seen some downtick days in terms of artillery systems lost. Still phenomenal numbers, but when you have had many days of 50, 40, 50, 60 pieces of artillery lost in a single day, then, you know, when you have sort of 21 or something, you're thinking, oh, that's a poor day, but still obviously pretty significant. In fact, we should probably look at Dell's daily figures because he puts the time and effort into that, and thank you for that, my good man. I presume he's still doing it at the moment because I think he's on holiday. But anyway, let's look at the artillery system losses. And as you can see, just huge losses in general, but actually a slight rounding off there of the of the gradient of the blue line, which signifies that actually we've had a little bit less over the last few days. And actually, sorry, I just want to get it so you can see it rather than have my face in front of it. That's what I'm talking about. This area here where you've had high, 74, 71, all these days of 40, 50, 60. And then actually we've had a week of far fewer, in fact, one right down there. So the last, you can see this dotted line, which is 7-day rolling average or trend or whatever. No, it's a trend line, dipping right back down recently. So, yeah, we have seen fewer artillery systems in the last week than we normally would, but we have been very lucky. Well, the Ukrainians have done such a good job of attriting Russian artillery systems that there have been some insane days. Okay. Now we'll look at the UK intelligence update for today because it pertains to personnel losses. The average daily Russian casualties killed and wounded in Ukraine has increased in August 2024 to 1,187 per day. So that is your daily average for August. Wow. According to Ukrainian general staff reporting, since the start of the conflict, Russia has likely suffered over 610,000 casualties. If we go back to look at the Dell stats, we can go to the data page and you can see here we've got personnel at the top of the table, and you can look at the daily average calculated across a number of different days. In fact, I don't know why that's not showing as it normally would. Anyway, this is what we want to see at the far right hand side of the data sheet. So personnel there, we can see that the added personnel today, 1,309, that's from the 4th, so it hasn't done a 5th yet. So it would be in one of these red colours as well, because it's a fairly bad set of losses. But apart from today's number, you've got a 30-day rolling average of 1,208, a 7-day rolling average of 1,308. So the 7-day rolling average is really high, and record daily high is 1,740. That happened right back at the beginning of the Kursk offensive. I do recall, I think it was the Kharkiv offensive, when the Russians were losing many, but the mean average at the moment is 761. So you can see that much earlier on in the war, when you were losing sort of 300, 200, 300, we were having absolute kittens when they're losing like 800 a day. You're like, oh my goodness. Then 1,000 a day was the big one, and now if you're below 1,000 a day, the Ukrainians below 1,000 a day, you think, oh, that's a really low number. And that was before. That was an insanely high number. So everything's been a bit skewed by the last sort of 6 months, where the Russians have just had huge attrition statistics for their personnel. And this is kind of borne out by the UK intelligence update here, saying that it's the daily average in August is pushed to a sort of record. The August 2024 increases in casualty rate is almost certainly due to Ukraine's Kursk operation and continued pressure on the Pokrovsk axis. Russia continues to rely on mass to mitigate their lack of personnel and equipment capability. So, right, we're not very good at using this stuff. We don't have the greatest equipment. Our troops aren't even particularly well trained. So we're just going to throw equipment and material at the problem, literally across the fields. And I'll show you a video in a second that suggests that. Although Russian pressure on the whole front line will continue over the next month, their capability constraints will likely continue to reduce their ability to exploit any tactical successes into wider operational gains. Russia's casualty rate will likely continue to average above 1,000 a day throughout September, as Russia continues operations on a wide front from Kursk to the north, in the north, to Robotyne in the south. Okay, and now talking about losses, the death toll of Russia's strike against Poltava and the communications training center there, and its 6-story building, that's risen to 54 and almost like 300 injured. So hugely successful attack, you could say, for the Russians there, and hugely disastrous, catastrophic attack for the Ukrainians. It is something that is, the Ukrainian population pretty angry and upset about that. And obviously, you don't know the effect of a strike like that on Ukrainian capability. Like, are they not going to be able to do comms? I don't know if there was drone operation training going on there. What is the effect of such a strike on Ukrainian capability going forward? I don't know, but you'd imagine there would be some. Right, the Russians are not only killing civilians, says Turchny, with missiles and glide bombs. We have been tracing how specific Russian drone teams are killing civilians with dropped bombs and FPV drones in Kherson. Check out this in-depth article on Turchny, where he tracks their daily crimes. And this is something that Andrew Perpetua has been ranting about for a long time, really. He's seen so many videos of Russian drone teams following civilians, knowing that they're civilians, like an old woman getting out of a car, following her, and then killing her on purpose. So purposeful targeting and killing of Ukrainian civilians. It's horrific. So anyway, there's an article in Turchny that gives you an update on the Russians doing that. And this is why Turchny, as one example among several, but open source intelligence sources in general are just doing an amazing job. Like Turchny here, I can't say enough how wonderful these guys are for putting in the work in terms of data collection, data presentation, data analysis, that is helping us understand this war in incredibly important ways. And if these guys weren't doing this, then you'd hope that someone else would be, but would they? I mean, it's down to individuals and groups of individuals who see the value, have a strong moral compass as well. They feel driven to report on this because it's important to them, because it's horrific, and they're looking at horrible things, and rather than me, but they're looking at these horrible things and taking that data and giving it back to the world in terms of a presentation with analysis and conclusions that here, the Russians are doing terrible things, and we are providing you with the evidence that they are doing these terrible things. Well done to Turchny for taking that on, because it's important to understand that when I did that video earlier on about disinformation, when you had that American sniper that's gone over to the US and saying, right, I know who the good guys are, and I've looked at the information, and his idea is that the Russians are the good guys. You're like, what information you looked at, mate? Like, seriously? It's just unbelievable, because the information is pretty obvious and it's out there, and the work of Turchny is helping us to understand the clarity, the moral clarity of who the good guys and bad guys are. And here's another example. So the strike on Lviv, where you had a hypersonic Kinzhal missile slam into a residential building. Of all the people in this photo, only the man survived today's Russian missile strike. So it's yesterday. Yaroslav's wife, Evgenia, and their 3 daughters, Yarinya, Darinya, Amelia, they all died at their home, according to the Lviv mayor. RIP, this is beyond awful, beyond painful. It's just terrible. And I've seen some lovely pictures of this family together. And he is the only one who survived that horrific strike on Lviv. Having just lost his entire family in a Russian missile strike, the only survivor of the family, the father, Yaroslav, was rescued from the ruins of the building in the centre of Lviv. Really, really horrible that. Yes, I think, was there... Yeah, I mean, you can go and see pictures of that. It's this picture that I think just, hits home that, doesn't it? Imagine being that guy, your entire world just lost like that in one morning. Just horrific, absolutely horrific. War Translated's Dmitry says, Russians are noting the effectiveness of the mass use of drones with incendiary liquid, saying that Russia has once again fallen behind Ukraine in terms of innovation. So this is, if you remember, the thermite canisters dropping thermite from drones on tree lines. We have seen now at least 2 videos, and this is the 3rd one, looking at the Ukrainians doing it from a distance. And he's actually filming that far away there. You can go and find that on the internet. But it's this idea that actually, and I was wondering about this, and actually I've seen a video of Russians trying to do it with their own kind of thermite in a test environment, and they're not doing a very good job. But it won't be long. So whenever there's either side gets some kind of innovation and there is some asymmetry, some advantage over the other side, you've got to really hammer that advantage as quickly as possible and as much as possible, because it won't be long before the other side gets to where you are. So if thermite is indeed, and it's not illegal, it's legal, used on, it's like incendiary devices, used on military targets, as long as it's not civilians, and of course these are tree lines full of dugouts of Russian soldiers. If this is genuinely a useful weapon to clear out tree lines and dugouts and trench lines, then Ukraine need to be using that loads and as soon as possible. Absolutely loads, because the Russians will get there. So this Russian says, it can be stated that the use of thermite drones by the Ukrainian armed forces for burning out the tree lines has become widespread and serially produced, and their effectiveness now looks much higher than in the initial videos. Unfortunately, in this situation, the Russian armed forces have once again taken the position of catch-up, and now they will have not only create their own analogues, but also look for means of counteracting these drones. So not only producing those drones to do that themselves, but find the countermeasures against these drones. These FPVs with an incendiary mixture are dangerous primarily because they are capable of burning out vegetation, grass, bushes, trees and foliage in a short period of time. This will open up the enemy's view of camouflage positions, which will deprive the defending units of property and ammunition, and the assault groups concentrated for the attack of the element of surprise. Being very effective, they need to hammer home that advantage ASAP. Now, here's a really weird video, just not showing you apropos to anything other than there's some weird behavior going on in this world. I've seen people hit FPV drones with munitions on them with sticks when they're on the ground. So they've missed, it's not exploded, and they've hit them with sticks and they've exploded and they ended up dying. What are you doing? We've got a guy here that's running along and he catches the FPV drone. And he carries on running with the FPV drone for I don't know how long, and there's a cut, and he's still running with it, and then it explodes. I would not be running along with an FPV drone, an enemy FPV drone, with an RPG warhead on it, whatever munition it is on it, and running along with that, thinking, I mean, if I did catch it, I'd be like, oh my god, I need to throw this as far away as physically possible so that it explodes over there and not on me. And anyway, this guy dies in the end. It's a horrific video, but like, just really bizarre behaviour. But that may be panic, and you don't quite know what to do with a explosive in your hand. Right, what other stuff is there? So 15th Brigade of Operational Assignment Karadag. So these are the guys that were brought to the Pokrovsk region to help defend it. 2,000 of these offensive National Guards troops. They are now destroying Russian equipment on the outskirts of Selidovia. So Selidovia was this town south of Novohorodivka on the edge of that Pokrovsk salient, where the Russians were just making huge amounts of land. They were taking all these towns, villages, and large villages and towns rather easily. Ukrainians were just giving them up. And then the Ukrainians seem to have got some defensive troops in place. And Selidovia is one area where they've stopped the Russians. And now we're starting to see videos of drone units. It could be that all the drone units were drafted up to Kursk and that there weren't enough of them operating per cross. But we're now starting to see more video evidence of Russian equipment being taken out in Pokrovsk. And I think that's just anecdotally, that's good news for the Ukrainians in that they are attriting the Russians once again in those areas. The passage under the train tracks was recently attacked by a tank. The brigade, it's visible, a Russian assault group was destroyed at this location. They're destroying Russian equipment on the outskirts of Selidovit. Okay, so I could show you that, but you get the point. It's drones blowing up stuff. Now, I talked to you earlier about troops being used in a meat assault. This is pretty incredible footage of troops just running across land that's being absolutely hammered by, I mean, this is almost like World War One charging across no man's land between trenches when you're getting absolutely hammered by artillery and mortar. Well, here we've got Russian assaults near Vuhledar, lots of infantry simply running towards Ukrainian positions under heavy mortar and artillery fire in complete meat waves. I can't really show you much of this, but I will just show you this little bit here as they are running across. You've got it sped up. They're running across from all the way up here down to here. This is a large meat wave, and there's stuff blowing up all over the shop, and quite incredible. But yeah, they are using meat waves because they want to get as much territory as they possibly can, and they don't have a cleverer way of doing it than just sending people and material in waves at the enemy. Certainly in a few of these locations. Vuhledar seems to be another one. And we've seen it in a number of different locations on the front line over time. So here we have a column of Russian Tiger special purpose armored vehicles destroyed or damaged and abandoned in the Vuhledar direction. So there they are losing inordinate amounts of troops and kit that then feeds into this idea that, you know, it's very costly for the Russians, as according to the general staff figures, but they are taking territory. So this works for the Russians. I say that they're not using a cleverer approach. I suppose, you know, why change something that's not broken? And for this, for the Russians, it's not yet broken. Like this is something that works. Now they lose inordinate numbers of people and kit, but they have been hitherto able to sustain those losses, at least to some degree. Now we are seeing a change in equipment used. We're seeing a change in the way it's used as well. So there aren't these massive 30 vehicle attacks anymore. There are at most 15 vehicle, but mainly 3, 4, 5 vehicles, as you can see there. There is in a sense that why change something that ain't why fix something that ain't broke. In a sense, it is broken, but I think you're seeing a gradual breaking of the Russian model of attack, where you're seeing lobster boiling in a pot. They can't do what they could do 2 years ago. They are suffering inordinately. They are still sort of able to do a bit of this. It's not fully broken, but it's on the way to being broken. We're seeing golf buggies being used and motorcycles being used far more often. We're seeing foreign mercenaries and people who are not fit for war being drafted into these positions to do this. We are seeing the Russians throw money at the problem by trying to recruit Ukrainians from occupied regions by offering them $4,600 to sign on in Kherson, and then pay them 2,000 whatever dollars a month to fight against other Ukrainians. That's how desperate they are for people. So I think that the whole system is breaking, but it's a gradual breaking, and there's no one instance where it all sort of falls apart and the Russian forces capitulate. Now, at the same time that the Russian forces, and that's personnel and material, are being degraded, like, hugely, but over a long period of time, the Ukrainians are as well. And it's this another form of this game of military chicken, where it's like, which side will break first. Yeah. Okay, now in looking at some fire, sabotage continues in Kyiv, sadly. Russia's probably managed to pay a few hryvnia to local thugs to set fire to military cars again. After a short lull, another one was torched overnight and flames spread to a second vehicle. So that's in Kyiv. Unfortunately, there are Russians all over Ukraine, or Ukrainians with pro-Russian sympathies all over Ukraine, who are willing to, or possibly even not actually anything to do with the ideology, just purely might be a money thing, on a dark web where you have someone that's hard up. Here's $1,000 or here's $300. Yep, I'm completely hard up. Yeah, all you need to do is set fire to a military vehicle in this car park. Yep, job done. Okay, I'll do that. There you go. Here's the evidence. Catch it on camera. Thank you. I'll have my $300. I'm actually pro-Ukrainian, but I'm even more pro-money. Could be, or it might be ideological. And nonetheless, it is definitely a challenge for the Ukrainians, as it is for the Russians and has been for a long time, with lots of things being set fire to in Russia. Often ideologically driven, when you see an old granny, as we have seen previously with a Molotov cocktail, trying to set fire to a recruitment centre in a local town, is because she doesn't want her family recruited, and there's an ideology to that. But you also get, I think, sabotage, partisan activity that is probably driven in large part by money coming from the Ukrainian government, and it's an easy way of causing problems for the Russians as much as it is for the Ukrainians. Okay. So Tim White says, I report on the worst out of control wildfires in Russia, so only fair to that I report the destructive fires in Ukraine too. I wouldn't call this a wildfire. It started by artillery, but Studynok is in Kharkiv region, only 5 kilometers from Sviatohirsk in Donetsk, so fairly near to the Donetsk border. 250 homes have been burned in the village, but the fire was started by Russian artillery. So yeah, huge fires have raged throughout the summer in places like Serebyansky Forest. Here's another place in the Kharkiv region that has suffered from war, where fire has caught as a result of ordnance landing. Yeah, very sad. Right, on to last night's attacks, distance munitions, standoff munitions. The Ukrainian Air Force reported on another massive drone attack overnight. So the Russians have really picked up their usage of drones. Let's go and have a look at the figures again. So if we go to drones, moving along the workbook at the bottom, let's have a look. Here we are, drones. And my guess is that we'll have a very large uptick in drones over the last week or so, and it does seem to be what we are seeing there. We are seeing quite a few really large-scale drone attacks taking place there, and I think, yeah, this yellow dashed line is going up and up. So I think the Russians, where they are possibly struggling to produce and procure missiles at the quantity they like to fire them, it seems that drones are fine at the moment, and these Shahed drones, they have their own facilities in Russia that have been constructed this year, and you're probably seeing this slightly steeper line here coming from about this time. You can see that there looks very different to over there. So I think this is almost certainly going to correlate with the construction of their own Shahed factories to make, instead of Shahed, they call them Garan drones in Russia. And as a result, they're able to throw more and more of these drones into Ukrainian airspace. So every night this week, there have been fairly significant drone waves. Here, 78 drones, 60 were shot down, so that's a pretty good interception rate. But nowadays, it's not just about the interception rate, it's about the electronic warfare effect. So 60 were shot down, One went into Belarusian airspace, we'll talk about that in a second, where it got shot down. 2 returned into Russian airspace, and another 15 were lost on Ukrainian territory, likely due to electronic warfare. In other words, 100% of them did not reach their target. So even with a wave of 78 attack drones, the Ukrainians are able to take them all out. I think that's incredibly good compared to the beginning of the war, where these attack drones were suddenly brought to bear by the Russians. They got a hold of them from the Iranians rather than making them themselves, and the Ukrainians had not adapted to that. The cities and towns were struck fairly easily by these drones, and now 100% of them very often are taken out by a variety of means. So really good news there. Now the Ukrainians, on the other hand, did an attack on Novorossiysk, which is the naval base down along the eastern Black Sea coast. The Russians pulled out their Black Sea fleet from Sevastopol in Crimea and have brought them primarily to Novorossiysk, but also a port that they're building in Abkhazia further down south on the Georgian coast of the Black Sea. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians were paying some close attention to Novorossiysk last night in terms of unmanned sea drones, so USVs, unmanned sea surface vehicles, and unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, the aerial drones. Both of those were attacking Novorossiysk. Now, I don't know if there's any damage done. My speculation is that the Russians are probably at a point where they've adapted to USVs, those Magura V5 drones, in the main. So somewhere like Novorossiysk is, and if they aren't, what they're doing. But I think they're probably well prepared to deal with those drones these days. So I don't know how successful such USV attacks on a port like Novorossiysk can be at the moment. It'll be interesting to see if the Ukrainians develop the ability to have effectively torpedo drones, where they're going underwater, drones that could be sent to Novorossiysk and then put on standby to hang outside the harbour and wait for ships to come out and then hit those ships. Like, you kick back up, and which we're seeing with UAVs at the moment. So we are seeing that happen with drones where they are flown, then they land, and then they wait for people to come out of their dugouts or to walk nearby or whatever, and the videos are kept on, so the feed is still going, and then they can either remotely explode or then take off again and do what they need to do. Saves the battery, so they're not always just flying around. So we're seeing that with UAVs, and I'm sure the Ukrainians are working on those. Well, we've seen some torpedo drones, we see some prototypes of those. So they're almost certainly working on these drones where they hopefully will be able to just hang outside the port and then hammer the ships when they are less protected, because they often have these booms and whatnot across the port entrances. So it's very difficult for drones to get in. Anyway, the Russian Telegram channels report sea drone attack on the port of Novorossiysk. Shots and explosions were heard for several hours. I did say aerial drones as well. Well, I have heard elsewhere there were aerial drones too, but maybe not. Who knows? Right, explosions being heard in Yevpatoria in occupied Crimea. Fighter jets are taken off from Belbek airfield in Sevastopol. That's this morning, so that is happening now. Now, going to that Belarus incident. So Belarus downs Russian drones over its airspace for the first time, according to monitoring group. The Belarusian Air Force downed 2 Russian attack drones on September the 5th. So one was mentioned earlier, but 2, according to this source, near the Belarusian city of Homel. The monitoring group Belaruski Hajun claimed. Colonel Sergei Frolov, the Chief of Staff and First Deputy Commander of the Belarusian Air Force and the Air Defense Troops, reported that on the night of September the 5th, their state border was violated in its airspace, likely by drones. A decision was made to destroy the intruding drones. You've got to mention it were highly likely that they were Russian-launched Shahed drones. So doing what Poland haven't yet done, but they're doing it in Belarus. Like, isn't that interesting that Belarus are okay with shooting Russian drones down, but Poland are umming and ahhing? There are people like Radoslaw Sikorski, the foreign minister, that really wants to do that, but the Polish are very reluctant to make it look like NATO are getting involved in this war. Well, Belarus are doing it on behalf of Ukraine. interesting. Anyway, that's caught on camera there. So in Homel, you can see a drone falling from the sky after it's shot down by air defences. Now, NATO has not given up on the idea of shooting down Russian missiles over Ukraine, according to the Lithuanian President Nausėda. So exactly the point I was talking about. He says, today we cannot say that this discussion is over, and we have some concrete results, but our countries together with other states initiate such discussions. So it's still ongoing. You would hope that Poland in particular will end up shooting down these missiles and drones that do get rather close to the border or even over it. Now, Noel Reports says, according to Ukraine's Armed Forces Strategic Communications, almost 3 out of 4, so 3/4 of Russian missiles target civilian objects rather than military ones. I've been long saying that the Russians are a bit silly. They have been concentrating too often on hitting residential civilian targets to try and break the spirit of the Ukrainians. But of course, as you might realise, it never worked previously when London was attacked in the Blitz in 1939, 1940, wasn't it? Maybe even onwards. Was it 41? I don't know. Anyway, the spirit of the Londoners was not broken. In fact, it united them. So that if it was an attempt to break the spirit of the Ukrainians, I've argued that it's a poor use of scarce resources. Although they weren't scarce originally, missiles are now fairly scarce for the Russians. They need to use them much more efficiently than throwing them at civilian targets to use against military targets, much more strategic targets. But no. Although they would say this is part of their strategy, it's just I don't think it's a clever strategy. Anyway, 3/4 have been used against civilian targets or objects rather than military ones. Most of the strikes hit residential buildings, hospitals, schools, and power stations. Of course, power stations, you can argue, is also a military target as well, considering without power you will struggle to make weaponry with your defence military-industrial complex. Sorry, words are a bit difficult for me when I've said so many already today. So there's an infographic giving you some, if you can translate that, gives you some information about the ordnance usage by the Russians. Now, yesterday's strike on Lviv mainly, you can see there were a few sent towards Kyiv, a couple of drones there. A few missiles sent just across the border to Sumy. Sumy's been absolutely hammered recently. And then we had these missiles coming over, a range of them. One Kinjal by the looks of it. No, Kate, is that Kate-22? No, that's not. That is, one of these ones. Two. Is that, I think that's Kinjal. Sent across to Lviv there. It's a hypersonic missile that killed that family. And then other missiles going at Lviv. So very strongly targeted yesterday. Indeed, one more thing worth pointing out, says Tim White, from Lviv, as with all major bombing sites, is the immediate aftermath, the cleanup, the repairs, but also making apartments safe. Lviv now needs to replace, from that one strike, 3,200 windows. Can you get that much glass immediately? And not to mention doors. I was in a village in the Kherson Oblast on the free side of Kherson, and there were piles of windows where it was the European Union had funded the replacement of windows in this village. That many you had Samaritan's Purse as well, was working on roofs, so you had a lot of houses had blue tarpaulins over them, and they were the Samaritan's Purse, which is a US, I think, religious charity that's working a lot in that particular area to re-roof these houses. And then the EU through funding through Czechia, I can't remember. Anyway, they were re-windowing all of these, refenestrating all of these houses. So in this village in the middle of nowhere, you had brand new windows being put up. It's a massive thing. It requires an awful lot of money and an awful lot of logistical forethought in order to make sure that these places that are consistently hammered by Russian ordnance are able to continue on, have their windows and roofs replaced. Anyway, in Lviv, at least 7 architectural monuments of importance were also damaged in that strike yesterday. All were located in a historic area and the UNESCO buffer zone. So UNESCO has previously complained about this, whereby Lviv particularly has been on the receiving end of some ordnance that is damaging historical landmarks. 2 medical centres were also badly damaged there. Okay, now on to other bits and pieces. We're going to start with Ukraine needs new energy, says Zelensky, of his government reshuffle. So we've seen a number of people come and go. Ukraine's government reshuffle is needed to strengthen the country, said Zelensky yesterday at a press conference with Irish Prime Minister Simon Harris. Here is a list of people who moved along. So here's how things stand last night in Kiev, according to Christopher Miller, after Zelensky met with his servant of the people faction to discuss the government overhaul. This is from my sources at the meeting, as well as faction leader David Arakhamia, who shared some of this on his Telegram channel. So Kuleba was out. That's a foreign minister to be replaced with the deputy foreign minister. The other big one, I mean, you can check all of these out. The Commission, Alexander Commission, is one that always gets me thinking about, what's going on there, because he was, I think, very good, doing a good job in an incredibly important position. So he was the strategic industries minister, in charge of making sure that the defence military industrial complex was operating and reacting to the needs of the front line and operating at the capacity it needs to operate, and getting the funding and getting the R&D and the infrastructure and the logistics sorted, as well as working with international partners on that front as well, and trying to get in investment and infrastructure from people like, for example, Rheinmetall from Germany, setting up shop in Ukraine. So it's an incredibly important job. He had previously done an amazing job with the railway network to keep that up and running, was moved to that position, and he yesterday handed his resignation in. So the question is, what's going on there? Well, actually, the good news is it seems like he's still going to be in the zone. So Alexander Commission will be Zelensky's advisor on strategic industries. So he's gone from being in charge of the department to being the advisor to Zelensky. So maybe Zelensky's bringing him in closer. Ukroboronprom, so that's the Ukrainian state defense manufacturer. Their CEO, Herman Smetanin, will take his place as a Minister of Strategic Industries. So hopefully someone with good knowledge about that. But yeah, good to see Commission is still there. Now, lots of movements. Sometimes people are shuffled from one to another. Irina Vereshchuk has also been dismissed from her position as Vice Prime Minister for reintegration by a vote of 55 deputies. Although her removal lacked sufficient votes yesterday, sources suggest she will transition to a role as Deputy Head of the President's Office. So actually, sometimes you think they're being dismissed or sacked, but actually they're being moved to a position that's really important still. Her former position will not be immediately filled as the structure will be reformed. You're thinking, well, in order for her to fill this position, that position needs to, that person that previously held the position is obviously being sacked. Don't know what's happening there, or whether it's a new position. And here the idea is that her old position will be reformed into not existing, but part of a new structure. So it's not always like sacking one and replacing them with someone else, and that one that you sacked just it disappears because you don't like them, they're rubbish. Actually, they're scare quotes sacked, but they're moved on to another position where they're still really useful and other things can happen. So you get the point. Right. The big one, though, the big one was Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba's resignation. Apparently it had been long anticipated. And it was not as a result of some fails, according to Euromaidan Press's MFA sources, so that's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In other words, and I was wondering about this because Kuleba's done a really good job and he's very well liked and he's respected around the world. So as Foreign Minister, he has been tireless, rather like Zelensky. The two people I think have been the most tireless in the work they're doing for the Ukrainian people have been Zelensky, just non-stop around the world, talking to everyone, doing as much as he possibly can, and Kuleba doing the same. And you might get to a point where, I think this for Zelensky, but of course there's no other option. You can't say, right, I need to take a year off now because you're in the middle of war. So he can't do it. But Kuleba might just be at the point where, mate, I'm exhausted. I'm absolutely done. And I think you need to bring in someone to this role who's just got some more energy, just while I recuperate and get my senses together, and then I'll go again. some other role. So it's not necessarily like a bad thing that people are moving, that someone like Kuleba is stepping back from doing that. He's offered his resignation in. The idea is long anticipated would I think indicate that it probably is a case of like he probably put the feelers out that, honestly, mate, can you find a replacement for me around about this time because I am done for. That's just pure speculation, might not be that at all. So anyway, he may be eyeing the position of an ambassador, with the US mentioned as one of the options, says Euromaidan Press. A detailed analysis on our site coming soon. So Vladimir Dubovic says, first thoughts on Foreign Minister Kuleba leaving. This is from the Professor of International Relations at Odessa. First, I think that no doubt the tremendous pressure on Minister Kuleba has taken its toll. He's only human, and getting a break of sorts, depending on whether he will be appointed to some other position, how soon, was needed. We can all agree that he was working 24/7 for the last 2.5 years, and it must be hard on him. Honestly, there will be a human cost, and yes, you are doing it for the country, and the country needs you, but at some point, you're like, yeah, but I am not doing the best I possibly can now, because I've just absolutely shattered. Second, this is a part of a larger overhaul of the government, so not a standalone shift. Zelensky, with his office of the president, probably thought that some rotation is called for. Third, it must be that Kuleba has felt that he has hit the snag on some fronts, primarily talking to Ukraine's partners about further aid to Ukraine. There's been a slowdown in that respect, and that must have been frustrating. It's also quite frustrating to all of us Ukrainians, actually, but he was at the forefront of the efforts to get more support for Ukraine, so perhaps harder for him. Fourth, the rumours have it that Andrei Sibiha will be appointed a minister instead. If so, Mr. Sibiha has experience in the field, so because he was a deputy, right? So he might fit rather well. Besides, the key decisions are being made at the office of the president anyway, where Mr. Sibiha has worked previously, so this connection might help for a smooth transition. As Zelensky dismissed Foreign Minister Kuleba because, quote, he lacks the energy to promote the provision of arms among partners, according to Suspilna. So that is another news site saying that it is just he's lacking in energy at the moment, and that's completely understandable. And I hope that's the reason, because that's the most beneficial reason for Ukraine. It's not divisive. There's no issues. It's just we need some fresh energy in there. And I know that from working in like educational institutions where you have the same staff working in the same positions for a long time, and sometimes you just need to freshen things up and get new ideas in, and new staff coming in is definitely good, and younger staff coming in who have fresh ideas straight out from theoretical ideas from educational research coming in and freshening the place up is really important. Anyway, according to Bloomberg sources, Dmytro Kuleba, who has resigned, is likely to focus on Ukraine's accession to NATO and strengthening support for the country. So it could be some role to do with that. Okay. Zelensky said, I listened to the report of Sursky on the front separately, Kursk region. All the defined tasks of our Kursk operation are implemented, says Max24, summarising Zelensky's thoughts here. So September should be productive for all of us. It concerns air defence, our capabilities at the front. We prepare meaningful things. Again, slightly cryptic there. Hopefully good news to come. Now, from a Russian point of view, though, at the Eastern Economic Forum, Putin addressed the situation in Kursk Oblast, stating that the Ukrainian attack on Russia's border regions failed to incite panic and instead led to a greater unity within Russian society. Actually, this was one of the things I talked about right at the beginning, that it could go one of two ways. You attack into Kursk, it causes panic and starts the Russians going, oh my goodness, what's going on? Our leader is a bit rubbish, panic. And then you start looking more negatively on the administration and on Russia as a whole. Or the rally round a flag phenomenon takes place. And I explained this a few weeks back when Kursk first started happening, whereby you get your population to, well, you don't get it, it just naturally happens where they unify around the nation, around a sense of nationhood and nationalism. So 1982, the Falklands War, Margaret Thatcher was probably going to lose that election, end up winning that election because everyone rallied around a flag. We're at war against those Argentinians, and therefore, yay, Britain's great and our leader's great because they are leading us in that war. Happened with 9/11 and Bush, right? You got a massive rally around a flag effect from the attack on the World Trade Center towers, and so on and so forth. We can see this replicated many times. So attacking into Kursk might actually have led to the Russians becoming more unified behind the Kremlin approach to the war project. So Putin argued that Ukraine's actions in Kursk weakened their positions on other fronts, which in turn accelerated Russian military advances. He also condemned the strikes on the Kursk nuclear power plant as a very dangerous act of terrorism and suggested that Ukraine should consider the repercussions of a reciprocal response. Of course, they've had a large part of that response already, with some massive waves of ordnance flowing into Ukraine. Now, of course, he's not talking about all the benefits that Kursk brought to the Ukrainians, but certainly every move that happens comes with a cost associated with it. You know, the good stuff will always have some shadow associated with it. Okay, imagine, says Zelensky about the Pokrovsk front. Imagine we had a 1-to-12 artillery shell ratio. What were we supposed to do? So 1-to-12 is what it was like. He claims at one point, yes, Pokrovsk, very difficult, but now the ratio is not 1-to-12, but 1-to-3. So the artillery ratio appears to be vastly improved for the Ukrainians, because certain forces, he says, and means are stretched. I presume he means the Russians there, but it's certainly the same for the Ukrainians. Now, just one more thing. This is with regard to Kursk. Just thought this was interesting that the bridges have been blown up at Kursk, and here we have someone crossing what is just a tiny part of the bridge left. So even though bridges have been largely blown up, they are still able to use, there you go, one of those bridges. I don't think you'd be wanting to drive particularly heavy vehicles over that, but anyway, worth taking that into account. Thank you for watching, really appreciate your support. As ever, another really long one. Take care everybody, speak soon, toodle pips.